Mr. Chairman, colleagues, and participants in today's hearings.
Councilmember David O.
Good afternoon. I'm present. Good afternoon, Chairman, colleagues, and all the participants and those tuning in.
Councilmember Maria Cañona Sanchez.
Good afternoon, everyone. Look forward to this afternoon's discussion. Thank you.
Councilmember Mark Squilla.
Good afternoon, everyone.
And Chair Derek Green.
Present. Thank you, Mr. Iannuzzi. A quorum of the committee is present, and this hearing is now called to order. This is a public hearing of the Committee on Finance regarding resolution number 20054. Mr. Iannuzzi, if you can please read the title to the resolution.
Resolution number 200054, resolution authorizing the Committee on Finance to hold hearings regarding public banking.
Thank you, Mr. Iannuzzi. Before we begin to hear testimony from the witnesses we have here for today, everyone who has been invited to this meeting to testify should be aware that this public hearing is being recorded. Because the hearing is public, participants and viewers have no reasonable expectation of privacy. By continuing to be in the meeting, you are consenting to being recorded. Additionally, prior to recognizing members for questions or comments they have for witnesses, I will note for the record at this time that we will use the chat feature available in Microsoft Teams to allow members to signify that they wish to be recognized. In order to comply with the Sunshine Act, the chat feature must only be used for this purpose. Before we call the first panel, would any members of the committee like to make any opening comments? Seeing none, I would like to say a few comments before we open this public hearing regarding public banking. As many of my colleagues know, I started my career even before working for Councilmember Marion Tasco or as a lawyer in the law department or an assistant district attorney, started my career as a banker. Some of you may remember the original Meridian Bank. I was an assistant branch manager at the Meridian Bank at Broad and Glenwood in the Garment Square part of North Philadelphia, right across from Joe Frazier's gym. And it was from those experiences in banking where I really became much more attuned to the issues that had plagued this city, this Commonwealth, and this nation from a systemic perspective in reference to access to credit and equity when it comes to finances. Many of our customers had some challenging histories and were knowledgeable of issues of redlining and the challenges in access to credit. And so for me, that gave me a perspective on some of the real difficulty that we've had as a nation dealing with banking. And as I came into my role as a member of this body, I had a chance to learn about this concept of public banking. It was something that was very interesting and intriguing and a new idea to come to the city of Philadelphia. I learned about institutions like the Bank of North Dakota, which have had public banking in their jurisdiction for decades, and some of the benefits and opportunities that could occur through public banking. Further, learning that other cities were also starting to investigate this issue and this idea of public banking and see how it could be positive for their community and their jurisdiction. I've also had a chance to talk with some of my colleagues in the National League of Cities or the Pennsylvania Municipal League and others around the country about the concept of public banking. Even more close to their home, Governor Phil Murphy, as he was running for election as governor, had one of his campaign platforms was trying to bring public banking to the state of New Jersey, and that's someone who was a former banker at Goldman Sachs. So this is an issue that I think creates a lot of opportunity, a lot of potential for the city of Philadelphia. We are in a space now that none of us could ever have imagined with COVID. And so we're doing and having these hearings remotely in virtual platforms like Microsoft Teams. And so we're literally in a brave new world because of the challenges of this pandemic. But this pandemic has also been an economic crisis for so many and has really illustrated the historical issues and concerns that many people have had in our city, in our state, in our nation, especially as it comes to finances and the ability to access credit markets. So I hope this conversation will be a fruitful one. We were able to bring in a consultant, HRNA, to provide us with some information regarding the feasibility of this concept. But this is a continuation of the conversation, and we'll have much more conversations as we move forward to the possibility of creating a public bank to benefit the constituents and the citizens of the city of Philadelphia. And with that, we will open the hearing. Our first panel will be Reverend Gregory Holston, followed by Anthony Giancatario, as well as Walt McCree and Deb Weigart. So we'll start the hearing with Reverend Holston.
Thank you, Chairman. Again, my name is Reverend Gregory Holston. I'm here in the capacity as the Senior Advisor to on Policy and Advocacy for the District Attorney's Office. And also I'm the Senior Pastor of James Memorial United Methodist Church in the Germantown section of Philadelphia. 4.5 years ago, while I was the President of OIC of America, OIC of America partnered with Power and the Union Unite Here to have what was called a Poverty Summit. There was released 4.5 years ago a report called Black Work Matters, which we had a great discussion of the issues facing of poverty in the city of Philadelphia. Numbers that I'm sure all on this committee are very well aware of, that we are still the poorest big city in the country, 25% roughly people in poverty, 400,000 people in poverty, 12.3 or 4% of those people living in deep poverty. That's almost 200,000 people making, as individuals, less than $5,500 a year. Those numbers are stark, and those numbers are real, and those numbers have been here in the city of Philadelphia really since the last 60 years, when manufacturing jobs in the city went first to the suburbs, then to the south, then overseas, and now have been mechanized away. We lost over 400,000 manufacturing jobs from the early 1960s to about 1985. And in those areas that have been devastated by that transformation, really no major industry has ever come back to those places. And we know all of those places in our city, places in North Philadelphia and West Philadelphia and South Philadelphia that have been devastated. We know about the manufacturing plants that still remain empty, rotted away over the years. We know about the damage that is caused, because if you put an outlay over those particular areas where the poverty is the highest, where some of those zip codes are now having 50% poverty rates and 50% people unemployed and nearly 60% poverty rates, we know the devastation that still remains and has remained generation after generation after generation. And when we look at our gun violence epidemic that we're facing right now, we recognize the gun violence has been here for a very long time and has been concentrated in those same areas of poverty. And so we recognize, as we learned and talked about at that summit, that Harrisburg was not going to help us, that Washington was not going to help us, that we really needed Philly solutions to handle Philly poverty. And one of those solutions lifted up 4.5 years ago was the Philadelphia Public Bank idea. Stan Shapiro and others who will lead this coalition brought that idea to us as an incredible idea that is so logical when you begin to think of it. when we are simply pooling our own resources together and saying that we are going to direct these resources instead of major banks who direct those resources for their own profit, sometimes being involved in instruments that are dangerous, that we can direct those resources in a way that is beneficial to each and every citizen of Philadelphia, and that the areas that are the most devastated, that have been redlined for years, that have been marked for no investment, that we can put our dollars into those areas and give people an opportunity to start small businesses, get an opportunity for people to get home improvement loans, get an opportunity for people to really have the dollars to take care of their own communities and their own people. So why is the DA so concerned about this? Well, we recognize, as I just mentioned, that all of the gun violence that we've been talking about in our community, that the first and number one reason we're experiencing it is the poverty in our communities. And unless we address the poverty and see poverty as a public safety issue and put our resources to ending that, we're going to continue to have the violence that goes on in our community. One last point on that, and I just want to be able to share so we're clear on it. Right now in Lower Germantown, as Councilwoman Bass has talked about, there are people shooting in our community and shooting over marijuana. They are shooting over the marijuana trade in the city of Philadelphia and killing one another. And we know for a reality that our leaders at the Harrisburg level, Senator Street, are working on bills right now to make cannabis legal. And so people are killing each other over an illegal trade, over something that may be legal. What are we going to do to take the opportunity here to be able to invest in new businesses, to create new opportunities for our own people in our own communities? If we had a public bank, we could invest in the kinds of businesses that would take those troubled young people who are doing things that are dangerous to all of us and move them into greater opportunities where they can use those skills and gifts to really benefit the community as a whole. It is the disinvestment in our communities that has caused the problems that we're facing, and almost every problem that we are dealing with right now is rooted in this disinvestment. This Philadelphia Public Bank idea is the kind of idea that can transform and change all of those conditions and move us and begin to move us in the right direction. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We'll hear from the next witness.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Councilman Green and esteemed council members, for this opportunity to address you today. I'm Anthony Giancaterino. I'm a dad of 3 young kids and resident of Mount Airy. And I come to you all as a director of the Just Community Energy Transition Project, which works with communities in Philly, Pennsylvania, and across the country to foster energy democracy, participatory policymaking practices to advance racially just strategies for a just transition away from an extractive economy. It is not news. We face interlocking crises of racism, climate change, an extractive economy, and the erosion of our democracy. These crises have weakened our economic well-being, threatened our sustainability as people on the planet, and most painfully have taken lives, particularly of Black lives, due to health and housing inequity, police violence, and climate disasters. Coincidentally, or perhaps by design, the United States government has increasingly turned a blind eye to these crises, leaving openings for privatization and corporations to take advantage of these situations. For example, I had the deep honor to participate in solidarity with folks in the Gulf Coast on the 15th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, which highlighted the devastating toll it had on communities and a wake-up call for the United States. At that point on, corporations and private banks have benefited from the cycles of disaster and recovery, a term that we've called disaster capitalism. They profit off people's pain, turning private interest from such as the displacement of people off of public housing into luxury condos, replacing small family-owned hardware stores that would have been very beneficial to help support the rebuilding of New Orleans and replace them with big box stores. And local fisher folk across the Gulf South lost access to waterways while fossil fuel companies leveraged private capital to explore and expand drilling. We may not be the Gulf South, but we share many of the challenges with them, and we must be in a position to avoid the same pitfalls. This year, we've witnessed hurricanes move further inland, wreaking havoc like never before, and that does not bode well for Philadelphia. The Philadelphia Office of Sustainability in its 2015 report found that a severe hurricane would cost at least $2 billion in damages to the city. Recovery should not be done at the behest of private banks or private off-takers. Public banks can offer an alternative to support local recovery efforts, such as the Bank of North Dakota, which mobilized over $200 million to assist small businesses, homeowners, farmers, and ranchers to deal with the Red River Valley flood and other tornadoes that have impacted the communities. What we need to match the vision that Reverend Holton actually talked about is accountable and local governance processes that center communities' vision and well-being, particularly those most marginalized by our current energy and financial systems. And this is why a public bank is essential for Philadelphia. And we need this to achieve a more environmentally just and equitable society, so we're prepared for the next disaster, be it climate, economic, or the continual toll of structural racism in our communities. A public bank would directly impact environmental and climate justice through the following ways. We could create access to non-extracted capital to support green infrastructure, home improvements, or renewable energy projects. We can offer credit enhancements or lower the risks of lending to people who are denied access to home improvement loans due to the complicated racist legacy of credit scores. Divest ourselves from financial institutions or private markets that are invested in fossil fuel companies or other extractive economic businesses that harm people and our planet. It can potentially act as a mechanism for participatory budgeting practices that support community solutions around land, energy, food, and sustainable infrastructure. And it can be a local mechanism for federal implementation of climate infrastructure programs. I offer more details in the written testimony, but just to offer a quick summary of 7 pieces that a public bank could directly impact around environment and climate and people, is it can make our schools healthier and environmentally beneficial. We all know that over $5 billion are needed to repair the public school system's buildings infrastructure, and millions more to make them electrified with solar heating and other resilient systems to be prepared for any climate disasters. We could use a public bank to actually support this change. Ensure our homes are healthy and fossil-free. Over 47,000 people remain on the Philadelphia Housing Authority waitlist, and many more live in poor housing conditions. It's been estimated that $2.7 billion are needed to make every home in Philadelphia healthy and secure. In particular, 2 in 5 all home repairs in Philadelphia require energy and electric needs. That is access to capital that most homeowners do not have, and the basic system repair program does not have enough funds to support. It can be a resource to help fund the PGW Energy Transition Plan as we transition away from fossil fuels to electric. It can be a way to help support access to capital and make Philadelphia not only the home of democracy, but the home of energy democracy, where communities actually have a say and to control how we own and create and generate electricity and energy in our systems. It can be a way to invest in climate just infrastructure and green water systems, to expand on the work that's been done by the city around water infrastructure, for example, to expand the Rebuild Initiative to incorporate more climate justice into its framework, to invest in carbon-free public transit systems for all, and to establish zero waste systems to support our sanitation workers. It can be used to help actually offer capital and resources for urban ag interventions and land stewardship, key ways to address the climate crisis today that groups like Soil Generation and others have done on very shoestring budgets. And it can be, as I said, a local mechanism to implement federal funds. If we see a sea change in federal administration, if there's a Biden administration in particular, we will see trillions of dollars flow for green infrastructure. It's best that we actually find ways to control that as a local community to ensure that those resources go to invest equitable impacts in building, rather than some of the pitfalls of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of the past that followed more private lending and private banks. I can offer more in the written testimony, and I look forward to supporting this effort. Thank you all so much for your time, and I'm looking forward to working with you.
Thank you for your testimony. At this point, we'll hear from Wal McRee and then Deb Feigart. After that panel, we'll open it up for questions. I know Councilmember Jones indicated that he has questions. If other members would like to ask questions, please notify us in the chat feature.
All right. Well, thank you, Councilman Green and members of the council. Very much appreciate this opportunity. My name is Walt McCree. I'm Senior Advisor, former President and Chair of the Public Banking Institute, co-director of banking in New Jersey, which is an originator of the State Bank Initiative in New Jersey. I'm also a founding member of the Pennsylvania Project, which began the idea of a Philadelphia public bank about 8 years ago. And I'm also president of the Public Banking Associates, a national consultancy for public banking experts. I've been consulting legislators and citizens on public banking around the country for the last 10 years. We just heard our previous witnesses indicating and describing needs and great ideas that are before this council at this moment. Like other great cities around the country, Philadelphia's wealth, its economy, its potential, and stability are beset by one big problem, and it's a monetary system, basically the whole system that has trapped these resources, its strength, its potential, in a web of debt. This discussion this afternoon is about whether or not you all want to continue with that tradition of being stuck in debt, or whether or not we want to use Philadelphia strength, fiscal strength, to move forward. Last year, the city spent $246 million to Wall Street lenders. And that doesn't include what you all paid for the significant sums for private money managers. This ongoing extraction of taxpayer dollars to borrow money is a big reason why Philadelphia will continue to struggle with growing poverty and economic injustice. But so it is. Dozens of cities and states around the country. Last week, for example, the Action Center for Race and the Economy issued a report that listed the amounts of money that cities and states, municipalities around the country sent to Wall Street and global banks and investors. $160 billion last year. So council must consider the fact that its current reliance on private capital relegates this city to being supplicants at the knee of Wall Street instead of powerful individual agents. Part of this unhealthy reliance on Wall Street is its ability and its practice of deceiving the nation's cities and states with predatory lending programs. All of you in Philadelphia should know that you spent $300 million on interest rate swaps in 2012. And that's just one city. Now, while creating a municipal bank for Philadelphia would not immediately eliminate the $250 million a year that you send to Wall Street, it would begin, this is the important point, it would begin an institutional pivot away from that by building an equity engine that leverages the city's considerable monetary wealth and resources through credit to small businesses, neighborhood development, and a plethora of long overdue needed improvements and possibilities, some of which were just mentioned. Indeed, creating a municipal bank would give Philadelphia the same economic tool that powers private banks and which has been proven to strengthen and stabilize local economies the world over. One banking tool of particular value at this time during COVID would be the ability to borrow loan liquidity at the Fed's discount window, which, as you may know, is charging banks, hedge funds, and corporate trading desks 0.25 to 0.75% on the money that it gives to these agencies, these entities, private entities, by the way. City equities. In other words, instead of more debt and taxes, you have more equity and profit. A Philadelphia public bank will keep taxpayer money at home to invest in itself, rather than sending it away for someone else to play with somewhere else. One final note here. Last September, the prestigious Northeast Midwest Institute issued a 100-page report, a highly regarded nonprofit, nonpartisan group, and involved with 18 states. And they issued a recommendation that all of these states should adopt a public bank, saying that, well, a public bank isn't a panacea. It moves government in the right direction because it addresses directly the common funding issues of uncompetitive financial markets, a lack of development funding, fiscal inefficiencies, and general fiscal health. So these studies and many others have convinced cities and states around the country, great cities like San Francisco, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, and now as was mentioned, the state of New Jersey, state of New Mexico, California, and many others engaged in the same process that you all are engaged in right now. So your choice is this. Either you're going to establish what could become for the city a legacy institution to monetize your credit for generations to come by creating your own bank, or you will continue to go on in the path you are now, which is to rely on profiteering interests in New York, which will necessarily produce this expanding cycle of debt and higher taxation and bypass the opportunity to create a new fiscal future for this city. I would remind you that Philadelphia not only is the location of one of the first national banks, but even before it was a city, in the early 1700s, the Quakers established the first public bank in America. It was what built this city. It was the public bank of Philadelphia, that mechanism that you can replicate. So as your new feasibility study mentions, it's going to take some work, but it absolutely can be done. Don't let anybody talk you out of it. Considering the alternative, this is something that really must be done. Thank you.
Okay, and we'll conclude this panel with Ms. Feigart.
Thank you very much. My name is Dr. Deborah M. Feigart. I reside in the Logan Square neighborhood in Philadelphia. I am a distinguished professor of economics at Stockton University in Galloway, New Jersey. I'm the author or editor of 21 books or monographs and over 100 other publications. My scholarship has focused on worker and economic well-being, issues such as discrimination, job quality, irregular work schedules and the gig economy, casino employment, minimum and living wage campaigns, the underbanked and financial literacy, student loans, and public banking initiatives. I'm honored to be here today to summarize my economic impact study of the proposed public bank in the city of Philadelphia. It is based on an earlier 2018 economic impact study I did for the proposed public bank in the state of New Jersey, cited in Governor Phil Murphy's Executive Order number 91 in 2019, establishing the New Jersey Public Bank Implementation Board. The New Jersey Economic Impact Study also draws on independent studies of proposed public banks in the city of Santa Fe, New Mexico, and the state of Vermont. Economists like me and urban planners and professional consultants use regional input-output analysis to empirically estimate the impact of a new product or a new service. As a tool, it has been around a long time. For example, the analyst can calculate the potential gains of a new local hospital, a branch campus of a university, a sports stadium, and a proposed Philadelphia public bank. In the case of a public bank, the empirical question asked is, how much new output, new earnings, and new jobs are created due to the new lending or credit issued by the public bank? The public bank would have a multiplied effect on economic activity in the city. Now, these multipliers are available from the U.S. Department of Commerce Bureau of Economic Analysis. They are part of a well-known and highly regarded regional input-output modeling system called RIMS-2. Multipliers are unique to each U.S. state and county for 372 detailed industries. I selected the multipliers for the county of Philadelphia and the industry titled Monetary Authorities and Depository Credit Intermediation. To calculate the estimated economic impact of a Philadelphia public bank, I needed to start with two assumptions for the projections. These estimates are related to the timing and amount of withdrawals of city deposits from private banks and the volume of new lending by the public bank. Ultimately, the decision about capitalization would be determined by a city council resolution, city regulations, and state law. And the actual lending decisions would be made by an independent bank board and day-to-day bank management. So my two assumptions for these economic impact estimates are: number one, what is the required reserve ratio, or how much would be held in reserve against deposits for cash flow? Here I used 10%, the reserve ratio for large private banks in the United States. The size of the Philadelphia city budget and cash flow would place the city's public bank in the large bank category by the Federal Reserve Board of the United States. My assumption number two, how much money would be loaned by the Philadelphia Public Bank initially for projects? Here, with the fully operational bank, the amount loaned could be up to 90%, holding back the required 10%. And I assume that the amount deposited into the bank and available for these loans is a share of the fiscal year 2020 City of Philadelphia budget before COVID. So I then calculate the economic impact on earnings, jobs, and value added, which is something like gross city product. The economic development impacts are shown in my written testimony in Table 1, which is available to you. Earnings would rise by $161 million to $482 million. Employment in the city would grow by as much as 10,755 jobs. Finally, value added, or Philadelphia metro area gross regional product, would increase by $1 to $3 billion. The overall takeaway from input-output analysis is that every $1 billion in new lending from the public bank in Philadelphia would yield approximately $142 million of increased earnings in Philadelphia, 3,171 new jobs in Philadelphia, and $1.5 billion in new metro area gross product in our Philadelphia, Camden, Wilmington metropolitan region. What other positive economic impact would come from a Philadelphia public bank? There are three. One, these estimates do not project the City of Philadelphia's fiscal savings on compound interest from borrowing at low rates of interest from the public bank. Two, we can also expect even more economic impact or economic activity when the projects funded by the bank become operational. These forward linkages are a result of bank lending and are not part of my estimates. The forward linkages of bank lending would generate new jobs and spending created by construction of low-income housing or investments in green energy or removal of asbestos from our public schools. These projects will also generate new local output, more employee earnings, and further job creation. This is because running a bank is unlike running other businesses. Spending the money from bank lending on specific projects breeds more economic activity. The mechanism for this multiplied economic impact from the projects themselves is additional to, is on top of, and separate. It is economic activity from the macroeconomic investment multiplier, a different multiplier than the economic impact multipliers used in the RIMS 2 analysis. The third positive economic impact from the public bank. There will be benefits to our regional neighbors. Earnings and jobs would increase outside the city of Philadelphia as well as within the city. The sophisticated process by which the Bureau of Economic Analysis calculates the RIMS 2 multipliers already takes these so-called leakages into account. Suppliers of some goods and services may be from outside the city. Earnings may be paid to non-city residents. But the estimates from the earnings and jobs multipliers here that I've provided for you are decidedly for the city and only the city. The impact of the new bank could be greater for our region. Thus, no matter how much is lent for projects in Philadelphia, there will be a positive economic impact from opening a public bank in the city. Let me add one final note. The reason why any bank can lend out 90% of its deposits and only hold 10% in reserve is understood by a simple difference between a stock and a flow. Every $1 billion deposited in a bank is not just sitting there like a fixed stock. When it is lent, money in the form of loan payments comes back into the bank every week or every month. So there's a flow of money back into the bank. Money works like a flow, inflow and outflow, not a stock. Pragmatically for you to think about is public banks are an alternative revenue stream for community development projects in a context where, frankly, increasing taxes is challenging. A public bank can yield positive local economic development effects through its basic operations and its lending. More technical details about how I conducted my economic impact study are in a longer publication I have forthcoming in the Journal of Economic Issues. I am making that available to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Feigart. Before we go with Councilmember Jones's questions, and I see Councilmember O also has a question, I'm going to attempt to share a video. Please bear with me. Hopefully this will work.
In this city, in anywhere USA, the residents of this city have
Can you hear that, everyone?
Yes.
Okay, let me continue. All right.
decided they want a park. The city council agrees the park is a great idea. But how will they pay for it? The city needs to borrow money. But borrowing money means the city has to pay a lot more money in interest and fees that could double the cost of the park. And that money leaves the city. It goes to
Councilmember, this is Frank. The video audio seems to have cut out.
Say that again, I'm sorry.
This is the clerk, Frank.
Yes.
The audio of the video seems to have stopped.
Okay. Let me try this again. So you're seeing the video but not the audio, correct?
We had heard the audio, and it cut out at the about 2:10, where you have it.
Okay, let me see. Hold on again. Okay, I see what happened. It was an audio error. So what we'll do is we will send out that video and see if we can put the video in the chat function so people can view it at their pleasure. At this point, I'd like to open it up to questions for Councilmember Jones, followed by Councilmember O.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm so very disappointed that video didn't work. I'm a visual learner, and I used to love those cartoon videos, conjunction function, something like that. I learned some of those terminologies very well through that mechanism. So I was hoping for that today in the public bank hearing. Couple of questions. Well, in another life, I was CEO and president of the Philadelphia Commercial Development Corporation, where we dealt with, we were the local SBA, if you would, for the city of Philadelphia. And we were able to see some of the benefit of publicly, semi-publicly financed projects and some of the rate of return that wasn't calculated on a private sector basis, but also on a community benefit basis, job creation, tax generation, and just beautification of blighted areas. So I understand how to kind of value those kinds of non-monetary contributions. But my questions are, and I believe I met with you before in a briefing in my office. It was in reference to the Federal Reserve's window and lending at 2.5%. What was that window called again? You're on mute.
It's a discount window, the Fed's discount window.
And didn't we meet? Didn't you brief me at one point in my office?
I've been at this for a number of years, Councilman, so it's quite possible.
Okay, and you mentioned in your testimony that a private entity could get that rate, but a government entity would have to pay market rate. Is that a matter of law by way of the Congress and Senate?
No, it's actually a matter of practice by the Federal Reserve, which whose function is really to support the money markets, the financial markets. The Fed has provisions in the law in sections 13.3 and 14.2 of its law to be able to monetize city paper, municipal and state paper, but it's really under restricted conditions. And in the MLF, the Municipal Liquidity Fund, they don't want to take money away from the Wall Street lenders. They really want to keep it. In other words, if you can't get money on the street, that's really the situation that they're doing. Now, there are only two loans that they've made out of the MLF. One to the state of Illinois, which I think was at 5.8%, and then they did one recently to the MTA, which was 0.85 below the market rate. So 97% of that money has not been used because it's so unattractive. So that's really, and the same way with New Jersey, the governor there, everybody's hoping to have money from the Congress, not having to go to the market to get it. But that's the way the game.
So if I understood your answer correctly, it is designed for us not to be competitors with Wall Street.
Exactly. Much better said. Yes. Yeah. And
go ahead.
Well, I would just add, which is why the value of having a bank, if you were a chartered bank, you'd be able to go to the Fed window. And as I mentioned in those notes, the reserve requirement has been removed. So the whole aspect, the expansion of lending would be quite much more available to you.
Thank you for that. And that gives me context. My second question would be, size does matter. And in the days of the Philadelphia Commercial Development Corporation, we did really well. We had a small bad debt portfolio, smaller than most banks, less than 5%. We were very proud of that, but we could not compete with the large volumes of loans being put out. So we would do 1-2 deals, some of them many of them are still around today, but it could not create enough velocity to change neighborhoods.
Right.
So how size does matter. How big should we be?
Well, that's not something we could discuss or could determine right here. I think you want to look at what your capitalization would be shaped around what you want the bank to do. But I think you also you have to look at what you've got available to work with. The city's funds are tied up and deposited, and I don't know what the numbers are, how many hundreds of millions of dollars are out there in agencies, in various corporations that the city owns, banks and so forth. But all of that money would become available to the bank for lending based on what capitalization the city was able to establish.
See, now when you talk political, I understand. You didn't answer me. How big should we be? And the reason I asked that, to give you context, our portfolio was about 10 million a year we could circulate. That's very small.
Yes.
In poverty sense, we get about $43 million for the city to deal with CDBG related poverty. So neither one of those amounts is enough to really move the needle in the right direction. So I'm trying to get from anyone who will answer the size of the initial investment and then optimal size over time that we should be to really put a dent into this thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at the difference at $10 million at PDC in a bank could amount to $90 million in lending capacity. That's that huge difference between having a revolving fund and having a bank. But I think quantifying it is the work for experts who can look at what the city really has available and could make available on a lending basis. But I think suffice it to say that none of your revolving funds would have the scale that a bank could have if you like the Bank of North Dakota, take all of your money in and put it in your bank.
Councilperson, may I? This is Dr. Feigart. May I say a couple of things, sir?
Please
Yes.
do.
The most in my one of the assumptions in my study is if you moved 75% of the general revenue fund for the city of Philadelphia out of a private bank into a public bank, you could create $5 billion of output and over 10,000 jobs and $482+ million of earnings. But that's just the general revenue fund. You and your colleagues have an interesting thing to think about in terms of the mission of this bank. And I agree with you, sir, that size does matter. You could, for example, in the legislation and the bank's mission, setting out the bank's mission, you could say, I am opening up to bank deposits for our public bank, not just for the city revenue fund, but I am encouraging public universities in our city or quasi-public universities to deposit their funds into the public bank. I am requiring public authorities, SEPTA, the airport authority, the school board, to deposit their deposits in our public bank. I am encouraging our nonprofit organizations in this city to take advantage of our public bank, put their money into the public bank, and therefore they can draw on loans from the public bank. And finally, you could decide that you want the public bank in the city of Philadelphia to handle in its deposits and in its financial management some or all of the public pension funds for the city of Philadelphia. So if size really does matter, you could really open up the public bank for business and require entities to deposit their public funds in the bank.
That was a definite answer. Final question is acceptable levels of risk when making investments. Does anybody have some general parameters. We at PCDC were able to take, so we were able to take more risk than the private banks were, because we were under the assumption that we were going boldly where banks would not go. So in our Citibank model, what would be the optimal level of acceptable risk and rate of return on investment?
Well, you know, I think the return on investment can be quantified in a lot of different ways. But I think that public banks, you know, their record is much lower risk levels. And I think also the bank has got to be understood as not a lender of last resort. It's not a charity. So it really needs to be moving its money into those channels that have experience of successful lending. CDFIs, for example, but many other nonprofit financial entities could be considered for doing programs that have a follow through and support. That actually is the model that the Sparkassen Bank in Germany, banks in Germany use. They lend money, but they follow through and support with their clients. And I think that's a very important part, rather than just sending out the money.
Technical assistance, you mean?
That's right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember Jones. I think that some of the questions you raised could also come up in conversations with our other panelists. One other point of information I want to draw on before we get into our next panel. There was a conversation regarding the federal discount rate versus the municipal liquidity facility. Just want to remind members of council that discount rate is the rate that banks like a Santander or Wells Fargo or a Mellon or Citizens, well, Mellon's no longer around, I'm showing my age a little bit. Citizens Bank borrow from the Fed, and then they lend out to individuals and companies and even public entities at a higher rate, and that's how they make some of the money. The municipal liquidity facility was something that was created by Treasury due to COVID, because they had a concern that many public entities like cities like Philadelphia or states like the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania would not have access to public financing for various needs they would have due to the COVID-19 crisis. What has happened with that municipal liquidity facility, as Mr. McCray has stated, there's only been 2 entities that have used it, one being Illinois and the other the Metropolitan Transit Authority. Because the rates that have been provided at the municipal liquidity facility have been higher than entities have been able to get in the private market. So the private market has actually been a little bit more beneficial compared to the municipal liquidity facility. But one of the options, if a public bank is created, it could borrow from the Federal Reserve at comparable levels as private banks and be able to provide loans with not having the same level of revenue needs as private entities, and could actually provide lending at a lower rate. With that, we'll open up to the second. I'm sorry, Councilmember O had a question before we get to the second panel. Apologize.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chairman. I'm not trying to be rude. I'm going to turn off my video camera just because I'm having some connectivity issues here. So hopefully you'll be able to hear me. So my first question is to anyone on the panel. Is anyone familiar with the Pennsylvania state banking laws, in particular Section 6152 of the Pennsylvania Mortgage Licensing Act?
I'm not.
Okay, I'm not super familiar either. I will say that my understanding is that in Pennsylvania, political subdivisions are not, they don't have the ability to create ordinances, resolutions, or regulations pertaining to financial or lending activities, under certain terms and conditions, but pretty much it appears to be in general, somewhat preempted by the state. I'm not saying absolutely. I don't know for sure. I was just wondering if anyone was familiar with that in comparison to North Dakota or what is going on in California or in New Jersey in their attempts. I'll skip that just because I guess it's just an issue we have to look at or be aware of. By my background,
point of information, Councilmember O.
Yes.
Are you referring to, is that section 1652 pertaining to mortgages only?
Yeah, it says Pennsylvania mortgages 6152, but its language is broad. It's broader than mortgages.
Well, I guess there's some additional conversation we can have later in this hearing, but there are entities like, as Councilmember Jones talked about, the Philadelphia Commercial Development Corporation, as well as PIDC, and there's other concepts we'll get into about the ability to create some type of public entity to do some of the lending that we're talking about.
Public-private entity, something like PIDC, perhaps. I'll move on to the next question, and that is, how do you imagine the purpose of the bank? How is that defined? For example, looking at North Dakota, which is, to my understanding, the only public bank in mainland America, not counting the Samoan Islands or something, basically founded in 1919 in an agricultural state, which of course now has oil, and a sparse population, and at a time where the banks were very heavy-handed and certainly not friendly to farmers, and it has developed and changed, but what is the ideal kind of set of goals? Because I've heard a lot of things. I mean, Philadelphia as a city gives money. It collects money from citizens. It fines citizens. It penalizes businesses and people. It's where it's get its money from. It borrows against the income it shall receive, but the money oftentimes is spoken for. Right now, according to the administration, we're looking at a $750 million budget gap. We've had emergency. We also have liabilities, unlike a bank. And I understand that this would be maybe something like PIDC, public-private partnership, or something that authority or entity. So it wouldn't have all those responsibilities, but there are like risks related to handling the fiduciary responsibilities of public education, recreation, health, and all that we have that money for. How would you recommend kind of like funding this bank with basically taxpayer dollars, or another innovative way of funding it to then somewhat lend it to ourselves where we're pretty sure we're going to pay it back, and make it available in a way where, as was said, this isn't a charity, it's not a money loser, but yet we're trying to fill a need that is not competitive, or if it is competitive, to make available to the disenfranchised, the underserved, a level of resources that we are not going to lose on behalf of the taxpayers.
Yeah, I'd like to just jump in here with that. You said a lot, a lot of inflating images. That's okay.
A lot of panelists.
It's not, the bank is not seen, we don't see the bank as being the city making the loans. It's the bank operating as a bank. And of course, the business of banking is to manage risk. It is not intended to be a public-private partnership where there are other stakeholders beyond city residents. The idea is to use the power of the bank, its capitalization, to leverage into those things that the city says it wants to do. So if you want to invest in, if you want to take a stake or if you want to invest in small businesses or in other affordable housing and so forth, there are systems that can be that are a business model. It's examples that can be successful that the bank would make the call on, not the city. So the city's responsibilities to fund the schools is their responsibility. The bank may or may not be able to participate with that based on how the bank is operating. So the bank, so they're distinct, and I think there's a huge advantage in that. And I think that the mission has got to include a very clear line between political and special interests and what the bank's mission is. So that part of the orchestration, the governance of the bank needs to incorporate the citizenry, on an advisory basis. And that the loans that are made within the confines or within the understanding of how a bank can reasonably make an investment. Right. So the idea is to get you out of the markets and to use the money that you've already got and invest in those things that the bank is committed to, with the citizens being able to see and observe. There's a lot of structural investment that the city wants and needs to make to handle the poverty and all of the development infrastructure and so forth. And the Wall Street banks are not going to give you a break on that. They're not going to look more favorably on that. If anything, it'll cost you more. Well, this is basically giving you the same kind of parity that the Wall Street banks have. The city's got a bunch of money. We can leverage it. We leverage our credit. We know our clients aren't going to leave because we know where they live. And I think that's the dynamic. That's the mechanical difference between this and a PDC, or other public-private kind of a deal. North Dakota, yes, 100 years ago, they had the same sort of crisis where the powerful financial interests were undermining their businesses, extracting the resources, foreclosing, and so forth. And through the years, they have been able to weather all kinds of situations, economic as well as climatological. The Great Flood and Fire of 1997 there. The bank was there the next day. And an interesting kind of a comparison. Grand Forks, North Dakota, Grand Forks, Minnesota are on the other side of the river. The flood wiped out both towns. Grand Forks, North Dakota had the bank. The bank was there the next day, said, here's money to help clean up, and mortgage abatement and so forth. And they only lost 17% of their population. The Minnesota side didn't get back for years and paid the price because they had to go to New York to borrow the money. So that's meant to be an example of the kind of flexibility that the city would acquire. But you've got to have bankers run the bank. That's for sure.
Yeah. Councilmember O, this is Deb Feigart, sir. I don't think a professional bank board would preclude entering into a public-private partnership with a local community development financial institutions. Certainly citywide and US-wide, small business right now is underfunded. Infrastructure is underfunded. So if you're looking to a model, the Bank of North Dakota has entered into public-private partnerships to the benefit of small business. The other thing they have done is for students who reside in the state of North Dakota, or for students who reside elsewhere and attend universities in the state of North Dakota, they are in a public-private partnership lending to students for student loans at less than market rate of interest, because the return on the investment is more than just a percentage. It's about investing in the future of, if you will, the educated population or the human capital of the population. It's a good investment.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Not seeing any other questions for this panel. I want to thank this panel for their testimony. We'll now move into the next panel, which is Vanessa Lowe, Margaret Lindsay, Peter Winslow. And when you begin to speak, please state your name for the record. And we'll start with Ms. Lowe.
Thank you very much. My name is Vanessa Lowe, and I'm speaking in support of the Philadelphia Public Bank, a mission-based financial institution centering its citizens. Speaking today as co-chair of the Economic Dignity Strategy Team of Power, Philadelphians organized to witness, empower, and rebuild. Power is a coalition of over 50 congregations in Philadelphia and nearly 100 statewide. We educate and mobilize our members to fight for economic justice. Past campaigns have resulted in higher wages for airport workers and our living wage bill, moving city employees and contractors to a $15 an hour minimum wage by 2022. I've spent the last 20 years of my career working to support financial institutions, providing needed capital in underserved communities. You see, my mother was a social worker in New York City while I was growing up. I knew that I wanted to do things like that, and I knew that she did work to help people, but my love for numbers and clearing bottlenecks in systems led me to the Wharton School for an MBA rather than a Hunter School of Social Work. While pursuing my public interest MBA at one of the most traditional of business schools, I learned about a new industry at that time called Community Development Financial Institutions, or CDFIs, as has been mentioned here. And I knew I'd found my calling. I took a position with the U.S. Treasury CDFI Fund, where I got to work on building the data set that reported out to the world that CDFIs were working. Mission-based financing was working. That these institutions were lending and could successfully lend to what were thought to be unbankable people and unbankable projects. They could transform lives and communities, create affordable housing, and do it all while managing losses and growing net assets. Years later, I got to work for the National Credit Union Administration, or NCUA. While working with this regulator, I was again supporting mission and member-centered financial institutions. Another asset-holding industry for whom member voices were centered in choosing how those assets were deployed and managed. Watching both industries grow in asset size and impact over the years has been a thrill. I'm currently working with my religious denomination's endowment, actually. We recently increased our commitment to community investing from 1% to 5%, opening up an additional $8 million to invest in the latest radical financing idea. Those FI investments that we've been holding for 25 years now have proven to be the equivalent of long-term CDs. There's been essentially no risk, but great impact. I'm now looking at 1863 Ventures and Collab Capital. These are Black, women-led, non-extractive equity funds investing in new majority entrepreneurs. Sounds radical, doesn't it? Well, CDFIs and credit unions at one time. The time is now to move forward with a public bank because it would tilt the city's full financial assets and resources to address the poverty, the housing, and the access to capital problems we've been talking about for so long, with little movement of the needle. Problems most keenly felt by Black and brown Philadelphians. Edgar Villanueva's book, Decolonizing Wealth, lays out a 7-step process for foundations to take the lead on reparation. To recognize that the source of the wealth they hold today is the monetized value of the land stolen from Native Americans. That wealth is the unpaid labor hours invested by my ancestors and many of our city council members' ancestors in growing and picking the cotton. Hours that today have grown to the share value of the apparel industry stocks bought and sold in billions of dollars. It recognizes that the land and those hours were ours, but we've been systematically excluded from those riches despite our investments. Edgar's book is written for the foundation industry, where he's worked for more than 20 years, but it's a blueprint for every person, neighborhood, city, state, and our country. A public bank would expand the table of decision makers and ideas for how we can use all of our dollars in reparative ways and mission-based investments. Let's take the power of now and move our money in ways that move our city towards the radical change we all need and want. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lowe. At this point, we'll have Margaret Lindsay to be followed by Peter Winslow for the second panel.
Good afternoon. My name is Margaret Lindsay, and I am a board member of the Philadelphia Area Cooperative Alliance, otherwise known as PACA, which aims to improve the lives of people in the Philadelphia region by growing the cooperative economy. I'm also on the steering committee of Philadelphia Neighborhood Networks. This testimony was primarily drafted by Jamila Medley, PACA's executive director, who cannot be with us today. I'm honored to provide PACA's testimony about cooperatives because business development in the Philadelphia region and how a public bank might support those efforts. Cooperative businesses or co-ops are autonomous associations of persons united voluntarily to meet their common economic, social, and cultural needs and aspirations through a jointly owned enterprise. The co-op business model is the equitable economic and community development model that prioritizes profit, people, and the planet. Cooperative business development is the economic development strategy that returns wealth to and retains wealth within our communities. They are effective because, one, ownership is rooted in the community and profits are equitably distributed, recircling money to local stakeholders rather than extracting it to absent ones. Two, they have lower failure rates than traditional corporations and small businesses. Three, they are resilient and adaptive during times of economic, social, and political crisis, such as now being in the midst of a health pandemic. Four, co-ops can preserve legacy businesses that are threatened by closure, especially with the silver tsunami of baby boomers retiring, by transferring ownership from individual owners to workers. Also, they boost the civic capacity of their participants, yielding myriad of other democratic benefits. And lastly, co-ops are known to treat and pay workers better, which is especially critical in industries typically characterized by low wage or inconsistent work. For example, construction, childcare, home care, cleaning, food service, manufacturing. The very industries in which we are seeing a rise in cooperatives. As a member-based nonprofit, PACA currently has 25 member co-ops that include grocery stores, daycare centers, birth workers, media makers, renewable energy enterprises, credit unions, and more. Our co-op members collectively employ over 500 people in mostly full-time jobs in Philadelphia. Over the last 5 years, co-op development in the U.S. has significantly advanced and shifted, changing who is served and how the work is done. In Philadelphia, we've seen a large increase in demand for co-op development from Black and Latinx communities. This has been coupled with an increase in interest from organizers of social justice movements who are looking to the cooperative model as a tool for poverty reduction, anti-gentrification, and displacement, and a supportive, equitable alternative for workers in exploitative industries. The majority of Philadelphia co-ops that were formed between 2011 and 2015 were nearly all white-owned with support from mostly white co-op developers. A major shift has occurred recently, where interest in co-ops has been most significant from Latinx immigrants and Black entrepreneurs. In 2018, 67% of co-ops in development in Philadelphia were majority owned by Black or Latinx co-op entrepreneurs. This can be attributed to a growing awareness of the benefits of co-ops to aid marginalized communities of color. It's also a reflection of PACA actively spreading awareness that co-ops can be part of the solution to problems that in particular are rooted in classism, racism, and xenophobia. Now, an ongoing challenge, however, is scaling and advancing the creation of cooperatives. particularly among the communities PACA centers its work with. And that problem is the underavailability of non-extractive capital. For many businesses' loans, especially for startups, lenders request personal guarantees or credit scores from borrowers. This can be a challenge when many people may own small parts of the business in a co-op, as in a mid-sized or large worker co-op. In Philadelphia, if we had a public bank, it could promote the cooperative business model and help build community wealth in our city by, number one, working with existing technical assistance providers like PACA, and or providing technical assistance to co-op borrowers to get them loan ready. Two, building those technical assistance costs into financing structures and or grant programs to support co-ops led by marginalized communities. Three, offering underwriting of high potential cooperative businesses. And fourth, creatively collateralizing, guaranteeing, or otherwise securing loans to co-ops. So in conclusion, in Philadelphia, we see that the majority of people turning to the cooperative economy are folks who have been systematically marginalized, therefore do not hold the generational wealth or credit scores typical banks require. We need better, fairer, more equitable solutions to capitalizing small businesses, including cooperatives. PACA believes that a Philadelphia Public Bank can be a solution to these ongoing inequities. Thank you for allowing PACA to offer this testimony today.
Thank you, Ms. Lindsay, for that testimony on behalf of PACA. We'll next hear from Peter Winslow.
Good afternoon, Chairman Green and members of the Finance Committee. Thank you for this opportunity to discuss the establishment of a Philadelphia Public Bank. My name is Peter Winslow. I'm a resident of the Westmount area neighborhood of Philadelphia. I'm speaking on behalf of the Philadelphia Public Banking Coalition and Neighborhood Networks. We urge the City Council to add a Philadelphia Public Bank to the city's toolkit for financial management and economic development. As Reverend Holston has described, the city faces no more critical issue than its ability to alleviate persistent poverty in minority communities by employing effective strategies to promote economic development that generates job creation. HRNA Advisors was engaged to examine whether a Philadelphia Public Bank could serve this purpose. Indeed, HRNA found that, quote, a public bank that lends money, such as our small business support model, could be an attractive proposition for the city, close quote. The HRNA study identifies a compelling reason why Philadelphia needs a public bank. Drawing on data from the U.S. Census and the Federal Reserve, HRNA calculates an $850 million lending gap for small businesses in need of funding, but unable to obtain it from existing financial institutions. A Philadelphia Public Bank can help fill this lending gap, as well as many other unmet credit and financial needs of our city and our people, as have been described by those testifying before me. Other methodologies employed by HRNA were less instructive. I will limit my comments to two observations. First, the foundational model is a straw man abstraction. The purpose of incurring foundational cost is to provide capacity with which to conduct banking operations. As the report states, quote, the foundational and small business support models are designed to be symbiotic banking structures, close quote. Yet, HRNA proceeds beyond analysis to assess the two models separately. In fact, the foundational model is shown essentially to break even, depending on the assumptions used. Contrary to the HRNA analysis, the findings maintain disingenuously that the foundational model, quote, runs at a loss and costs the city money. It will not, of course. But the city doesn't seek control of its money just to invest in the same portfolio being provided by for-profit banks. The Philadelphia Public Bank will employ its resources locally for optimal benefit to Philadelphia, rather than seek profit maximization wherever it can be found. Second, return on average assets, ROAA, is an incomplete and inadequate metric for assessing the Philadelphia Public Bank. A traditional bank seeks profits wherever they can be found. The Philadelphia Public Bank will keep its investments in Philadelphia, even if a higher return could be derived by, say, drilling for oil in the Indonesian rainforest. Furthermore, unlike with a for-profit bank, the benefits for the city doesn't end when a loan is repaid with interest. The economic impact of the business activity empowered by the Philadelphia Public Bank loan ripples through our community, as Professor Feigert has described with the multiplier effect. And some of the benefit rebounds directly to the city in higher sales, wages, income, and property taxes. The HRNA study was intentionally limited in scope. It didn't examine benefits outside the banking business model. The HRNA study did not examine other needs that can be addressed by a public bank, including education, housing, and the environment. Furthermore, the HRNA study ignored the needs of the city itself for infrastructure development or crisis management, instead looking only at lending to underserved small businesses in the private sector, important as that is. So the Finance Committee should review the HRNA report within the larger context of all the benefits available from a prospective Philadelphia Public Bank. Remember what Walt McGree described. What if Philadelphia had a public bank now? Well, the city carries around $6 billion of outstanding bonded debt at interest rates ranging to 5.25%. 90% of that debt is at 5% or higher interest. A Philadelphia Public Bank with access to the Federal Reserve could currently borrow at 0.25% and use those proceeds to purchase city debt on the open market. $5 billion at 5% would produce $250 million of interest income while incurring $12.5 million of interest expense. The Philadelphia Public Bank would thereby receive net $237.5 million annually to cover its operating expenses and fund its programs without requiring the city to incur any additional expense. The HRNA model estimated under $7 million in non-interest operating expenses. So the Philadelphia Public Bank would be self-sustaining and would grow its reserves by over $230 million per year before earning returns on its loan portfolios. Suppose the programs of the Philadelphia Public Bank didn't need all of an additional $230 million per year. The Philadelphia Public Bank could then renegotiate the bond rate from 5% to, say, 3%, saving the city $100 million per year in interest expense. Folks, this is a no-brainer. I urge the city to establish a Philadelphia Public Bank. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Winslow. I know we're getting ready for another panel. We have both Jackie Dunn, our acting city treasurer, as well as representatives from HRNA, who I believe will not be ready until 3 o'clock. I'm going to ask some questions to this panel, but if we could have council tech staff and the clerk's office reach out to Beth Finn so we can have her come in to testify. I will ask a few questions that I have prior to that. Also like to acknowledge that Councilmember Helen Gim is also present for the hearing. So Ms. Lowe, you have a very interesting background. Wanted to follow up on some of your thoughts in reference to some of the macro issues and delve into those a little deeper, especially considering your background at a national level regarding CDFIs and well, more specifically credit unions, and get your perspective on the benefits that credit unions have had in reference to access to credit, especially for small businesses, and how a public bank in a parallel way could also be very helpful for small businesses, especially businesses of color and those in the African American community.
Well, credit unions are they have that very defined membership based, and so they're much more community oriented, and the regulations are different from the larger banks in that they are limited to the type of investments that they can make with the assets that they have. But also just by nature and the origins of credit unions, they are much more focused on their membership and their membership best interests. The phrase that I often use when people start talking to me about where they bank is sort of like, credit unions, you're going to do better at a credit union for your car loan. In terms of commercial lending, there's actually, I'll acknowledge there's actually a small percentage of credit unions that are doing it, but the ones that are doing it, again, they're doing it based on community relationships, and they're doing it in the local community. That is their defined membership base, and I think that really makes a difference. We'll just say the city banks and the larger institutions, decisions are being made in North Carolina for people who are trying to borrow in Tennessee, or, up in upstate New York. So that local and community relationship, I think, is really critical, and that is something that both CDFIs and credit unions bring.
And then from your perspective regarding CDFIs and how you would see some distinctions between CDFIs and a possible public bank.
Sorry, give me that question one more time.
I have a phone ringing in my background. Hold on one second. Okay. Sometimes doing constituent services in your office and hosting a Zoom finance hearing do not equate at the same time.
Absolutely.
So one of the things I was saying in reference to CDFIs, and I'll tweak my question a little bit more. CDFIs, or as you are very familiar with, community development financial institutions, and Councilmember Jones kind of touched on this in his questions in the first panel. Like the entity he ran for so many years, PCDC, the Philadelphia Commercial Development Corporation, have limited resources. So one of the ideas I've heard in reference to the ability of a public bank is to provide some additional enhancement for CDFIs to help them grow and do lending directly to CDFIs, which typically you don't see that with credit unions, because credit unions, as you stated, are really membership and mission based. So they're trying to help their members. That's why you see often a Navy Federal credit union or other credit unions based on a specific employer like a AT&T or a Verizon, because members of that community or employment base decided to start a credit union. For example, my dad was one of the early members of my church's credit union, which, members of the church at Canaan Baptist came together to provide loans to each other. However, community development financial institutions, or CDFIs, they provide loans to the community like a traditional bank, but because their resources are limited, they only can do but so much. And so one of the ideas I've heard regarding a public bank is providing additional resources to a CDFI so they can do additional lending, as well as doing other types of indirect enhancements for those who are trying to get access to credit markets. So I'm curious about your take in reference to credit unions and CDFIs.
Thank you for the question, and it's actually a really great one. So one of the big differences between CDFIs and the traditional banks and credit unions is depositories versus non-depositories. So the credit unions and the banks have the license to take deposits from individuals. CDFIs generally don't have that. CDFIs are made up of loan funds, There's also a couple of venture capital, a couple of banks, and actually lots of credit unions are in there too. But if you're talking about the traditional loan funds, they're not depositories. So when they first started, they were dependent on, the wonderful nuns who actually put up their retirement resources and said, we think you've got a good idea and we're putting our money out here for it. So they've gotten more sophisticated over the years, as the data that I got to work on showed, in doing partnerships with traditional banks, getting more capital from the socially responsible investing, now called ESG community. The CDFI fund has certainly been a boon for them. So that's now a well-established and large sort of network of organizations. And at the same time, because they are not depositories, they could absolutely use another source of capital. And I think the Philadelphia Public Bank, being a source of capital for CDFIs, essentially a city CDFI for the city's CDFIs, would be an absolutely wonderful use of that.
Okay. Before we go into Mr. Winslow, I want to ask the tech staff or the clerk's office if we are able to bring in Ms. Finn after Mr. Winslow for her to testify. I do know that we have the acting city treasurer and HR&A who's not available until 3 o'clock. So can you let us know if that's feasible at this time?
Yes, that is.
Okay, so why don't we go to Mr. Winslow, and then we'll try to bring in Beth Finn so we can hear her testimony. Mr. Winslow, go ahead.
Thank you, Councilman Green. To address your question, following the established practices of the Bank of North Dakota, the banks in Germany and elsewhere, we envision the public bank acting in partnership with the other financial institutions within the community to strengthen the entire financial ecosystem of the community. We don't expect it to be in competition, and HR&A and their analysis also was not suggesting that the bank would be in competition with existing banks because they were looking to open up markets that were not currently being addressed. So there are many ways in which that ecosystem can be nurtured and be helped. There is a provision in federal law for a bank service company that could be fostered by the public bank that would enable all of the institutions within the community to lower their operating costs by centralizing some of their service functions, for example. But there is opportunities for increasing the lending capacity of CDFIs, credit unions, and others by cross-collateralization, by investment, infusion of capital, in a variety of ways. And the public bank could serve as a warehouse or a clearing securitization function for the loans that are derived by the financial institutions in the community, which allows them to recirculate their lending capacity at a faster rate. There are ways that with programs working in concert, there can be credit enhancement for loans that can result in blended rates and lowering the rate for borrowers without impairing either the capacity or the revenue stream of the other financial institutions. There are a variety of ways in which this can be done in partnership, and that's really what the public bank can do, is establish a much more robust, resilient ecosystem that can respond rapidly to events such as the pandemic, to disasters as Anthony was talking about that we're anticipating with the climate disruption and all of these things. So that's really where the concept is.
Thank you, Mr. Winslow. If there are no other questions from other members of council for this panel, at this point, I'd like to have tech staff and the clerk's office reach out to Ms. Finn for her testimony. Hello?
Hello?
Yes, Ms. Finn, hi. You are
Oh, hi.
dialed into the Finance Committee hearing.
Oh, wonderful. Great. Thank you.
If you could state your name for the record and then proceed with your testimony.
Yes, sure. My name is Beth Finn, and I will begin. Members of the Finance Committee, Committee Chair Councilmember Green, thank you for having this very important hearing today on establishing a public bank in Philadelphia. My name is Beth Finn, and I am a member of the Philadelphia Public Banking Coalition and the president of Pennsylvania National Organization for Women. I live in the Society Hill section of Philadelphia. I am in support of establishing a public bank here in Philadelphia. Our public money should be used for the public good here at home, and a Philadelphia Public Bank would help ensure that our money is being invested in our local communities and in projects that benefit our city and its residents. We have heard much today about how public banks have provided financial stability in times of crisis and how one in Philadelphia could lead to economic benefits for the people living here. I would like to make 3 additional points. First, a Philadelphia Public Bank could fund projects that would directly benefit the school district of Philadelphia. Our school buildings are in desperate need of repairs and updates. The technology required by our schools, especially in these times of remote learning, also requires regular maintenance and improvement. Second, a Philadelphia Public Bank could fund projects that will increase the stock of available affordable housing in our city. We face a housing crisis that is only getting worse, and the projects this council would like to undertake to address it take money. These kinds of capital improvement projects are ideal for funding and low-cost financing by our own public bank. Financing them through a Philadelphia Public Bank allows us to take advantage of better lending rates and ensure that the projects funded create jobs for local Philadelphians. Finally, I'd like to discuss the risks of not starting a public bank in Philadelphia. Currently, the city has its funds in notoriously untrustworthy institutions. Wall Street banks are motivated solely by profit to their shareholders. They use our deposits to invest in projects they choose that do not serve the needs of our city, and they have undertaken questionable and illegal practices that harm the residents of Philadelphia. The city has been to court several times with Wells Fargo alone. Judgments against them based on their discriminatory and predatory lending practices add up to hundreds of millions of dollars, and Wells Fargo is not the only bad actor. We have had issues with Bank of America, Barclays, and others as well. Thousands of Philadelphians were directly affected by foreclosures during the financial crisis of 2008. These Wall Street banks were responsible for that collapse. There is nothing more risky than placing our faith in the big banks that are still considered too big to fail, while we here in Philadelphia are not. In closing, I urge you to establish a Philadelphia Public Bank for our public money to serve the public good. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Finn, for your testimony. Are there any questions from members of council for any of the panelists on this second panel?
Councilman?
Yes, I think that was Councilmember Bass.
Yes, that's correct.
Yes.
I just really wanted to thank you, and I wanted to thank Ms. Finn for her comments regarding the untrustworthiness of some of our banks that we do business with here in the city of Philadelphia. And specifically, I want to just point out that, a few years ago, we had a bill, my office produced a bill that would divest ourselves from Wells Fargo, which at the time was, really getting a lot of attention for its very unethical banking practices, in which they also ended up firing a number of lower level employees who did not reap the benefits of the fraudulent practices of Wells Fargo. So I just really wanted to also put that on the table as a strong proponent for a public bank for the city of Philadelphia. It makes perfect sense. It's the right thing to do. And I'm certainly hopeful that my colleagues would agree. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember Bass, for your participation in the hearing and your comments. With that, we will close this second panel. I want to thank all of the witnesses for testifying this afternoon. Thank you for your participation and advocacy regarding this issue. At this point, we're going to then have our acting city treasurer, Ms. Dunn, to provide her testimony. Okay. Why don't we do this? Because we're trying to get both this done as well as HRNA. If we could take maybe a brief break, and then we'll come back. That would also give our phenomenal stenographer and tech staff and clerk's office a few moments to stretch and do some light yoga as we prepare for our next two panels. Thank you so much. We'll be back in a few moments. Thank you. I want to welcome you back to the Council Committee on Finance hearing Resolution 200054, resolution regarding public banking. We're now joined by our acting city treasurer, Jacqueline Dunn. Ms. Dunn, thank you for being here. Just wanted to state for the record, thank you for your office's work on this matter. I know we've been working on this issue and topic for some time in numerous hearings and conversations and emails in person. And then in COVID, we went into our virtual communication, and you've been working with the consultant that we brought in, HRNA, to help in this process. And I believe they are now coming into this Finance Committee hearing. So thank you for being available to testify. And if you could proceed with your testimony.
Absolutely. Thank you, Councilman Green. Good afternoon, Chair Green and members of the committee. My name is Jackie Dunn, and I am the acting city treasurer. I'm here today to testify on the city commissioned public bank feasibility study. We thank HRNA advisors for taking an independent look at complex questions around the financial, legal, and administrative feasibility of a city-owned bank. I also want to thank Councilmember Green for his leadership in looking at a public bank as an innovative way to address systemic challenges and work toward a more equitable Philadelphia. And finally, I also want to recognize those who offered public testimony today, as well as provided valuable insights and research to our consultant HRNA advisors for their review. While the administration is neutral on the concept of a public bank, we look forward to further discussions with City Council on the idea. And this concludes my testimony. I'm happy to take any questions at this time.
Thank you, Ms. Dunn. Also, I'm not sure if I said this earlier, wanted to acknowledge that Councilmember Kendra Brooks was also part of this hearing. We now have representatives from HRNA. So I'd like to, at this point, have Ms. Dunn here for a few moments and then transition to HRNA as they're coming into the teams. But Ms. Dunn, I'll ask you one quick question as representatives from HRNA come into the hearing. They talked about some of the inequities that we see in the city. From your perspective, did you have any additional thoughts you would like to opine in reference to that aspect of public banking, or just some of the inequities you see in the city? I know the administration is being very cautious, as they should, in any type of new venture, but just want to get some of your global thoughts, and then we'll go into HRNA.
Sure, thank you. Absolutely, I think HRNA, really addressed some questions head on about ways that we can further look to reduce and close gaps to our underserved and unserved communities in Philadelphia, particularly communities of color who face lending disparities, challenges obtaining credit, and small business challenges that have only become, more real in this COVID-19 environment. And so I think, we are, as you said, concerned about what this might mean for the city's finances, and would want to really understand how we can balance those concerns against the very real needs that are still out there, and look to council to really think what you think those priorities should be and how we can best address those going forward.
Okay. With that, we'll now bring in, make sure I get the pronunciation properly, Andrea Batista Schlesinger for HRNA, as well as Ariel Benjamin. If you can state your name for the record and then proceed with your testimony.
Excellent. Thank you, Councilmember Green. My name is Ariel Benjamin, and I'm a director at HRNA. We're also joined by my colleague, Andrea. And Andrea, do you want to introduce yourself briefly?
Hi there, Andrea Batista Schlesinger, partner with HRNA, where I lead our inclusive cities practice.
Great, and I'll go ahead. I'll be giving you all my testimony today. So again, thank you for having us here today to provide our testimony on the Philadelphia Public Bank Feasibility Study. My name is Ariel Benjamin, and I'm a director at HRNA Advisors, a firm working at the intersection of public policy, economic development, and urban transformation. Andrea and I lead our inclusive cities practice at HRNA. the City of Philadelphia hired our firm to conduct an independent feasibility analysis for an entirely new way of banking. That new way is the City of Philadelphia Public Bank. In my testimony today, I will speak about the banking opportunities and challenges that informed our feasibility analysis and our findings and recommendations. Andrea and I are happy to take any questions at the end. So, in a direct relationship to the city's poverty rate, today more than 35% of Philadelphians are either unbanked or underbanked, a rate that is higher in Philadelphia than any other major U.S. city, according to data from Prosperity Now. Small businesses are also underserved by traditional banking services. According to the city's 2019 report, Growing with Equity, Philadelphia is behind its national peers in terms of new business creation and Black-owned business creation and growth. One likely cause of Philadelphia's lag is stifled access to capital in the form of loans. Loans allow small businesses to form, grow, and stabilize, and in turn create permanent local jobs. In Philadelphia, 88% of small businesses in low and moderate income census tracts are not receiving any loans. National surveys estimate that only 29% of Black small businesses that applied to loans received them, compared to 60% for white small business owners. Despite the city's important work to improve access to financing for small businesses, many small businesses, particularly those that are owned by Black and Latinx residents, face significant credit and capital shortages. HRNA estimated that the lending gap for small businesses in Philadelphia is at least $840 million. In 2020, we are all but certain that this lending gap has widened due to the economic implications of COVID-19. This gap is so large and the trends are so pervasive that it is clear that the problem is structural. A structural problem requires a structural solution. Enter the call for a new way of banking, in which a public bank would be able to make different determinations about risk, account for inherent biases in these calculations, and value community well-being beyond profits. Our client team, the Philadelphia Public Bank Working Group, determined that supporting small businesses was its top priority for a public bank, with attention to uplifting underserved Black and Latinx businesses so that they grow, create more jobs, and build community wealth. Our client team also determined that another goal of the public bank should be to uphold autonomy over the city's financial resources. We keep these two goals central to our examination of the feasibility of the public bank. Local governments have an obligation to think deeply about how to leverage each dollar of public taxpayer revenue to create the most value for their cities. To put a finer point on it, cities are large and important clients of banks and therefore have enormous leverage. The city of Philadelphia houses millions of dollars in its operating and investment accounts in 11 authorized depository institutions. 11 major commercial banks, nearly all of which you know by name and may do personal or business banking with. The question is, how can the city of Philadelphia bank those dollars in ways that helps their residents, many of whom are poorly served by the private banks? Can the city do more or do better with those dollars? Of course, these questions are even more urgent as we begin an era of profound fiscal challenge. Current banking laws and regulatory norms are staples of common practice and are a manifestation of appropriate precautions to protect taxpayer dollars. A public bank takes a new approach. While implementing said bank will be extraordinarily challenging, we believe that this feasibility study is a meaningful step to understand why and how the city can and should interrupt the status quo. We also recognize that while the rhetorical benefits of a public bank inspire us to think boldly, oversimplifying the feasibility of establishing such institutions will not advance racial and economic equity alone. So now onto our findings and recommendations. The purpose of our report is to set a direction for an optimal public bank structure in Philadelphia. In doing so, we evaluated feasible if and looked under the hood to identify what it would take to create a Philadelphia public bank that meets the two goals set out by the working group. We responded to these goals and assessed the feasibility of two banking models: a foundational public bank that houses the city's municipal deposits and operating accounts, and secondly, a small business support model to extend access to credit to underserved businesses across Philadelphia. The small business support model includes 3 permutations that offer paths to indirect and direct small business lending. We find that establishing a Philadelphia public bank will not be easy, but it is possible. We find that a city-controlled public bank can be feasible if the city and the Commonwealth undertake a series of legal actions and structure the bank to maximize lending impact. Our recommendations can be organized into 3 categories: legal, financial, and administrative. So, finding 1, legally, we recommend that Philadelphia's public bank is structured as a city-controlled authority. Establishing an authority rather than a city agency requires enabling legislation from the General Assembly and passage only once by each house, a relatively streamlined process compared to processes that involve changing the Pennsylvania Constitution. After an authority is established, the authority must gain approval from the Commonwealth to receive a bank charter and city authorization to serve as a city depository. Changing laws and policies will require significant political capital and time, and must contemplate changes that potentially expose taxpayers' funds to greater risk. Second, financially, the public bank must participate in lending activity to avoid operating at a loss. We project that the foundational model may return a negative return on average assets, or ROAA, of negative 0.17%, which alone is financially infeasible and particularly impractical compared to the returns the city earns from its current consolidated cash accounts. Adding small business lending allows the small business support model to achieve an ROAA of positive 1.42 to 1.46% and can narrow the small business lending gap. We recommend that the city focus on the small business support model as it considers a public bank. Finally, administratively, we advise a governance structure that provides subject matter expertise, adopts best practices, allows for effective decision-making, and earns widespread support inside and outside of government. A public bank is among a suite of tools that the city can implement to support small businesses and address the problems of ongoing and racialized poverty that characterizes this otherwise proud city. While exploring the creation of a public bank, we hope that the city takes immediate and bold steps to support its Black and Latinx residents to create and grow their small businesses, and we hope that this study serves as a launching point for making an immediate impact while laying the groundwork for systemic reform. Thank you again. And thank you to the City Treasurer's Office, the Office of City Council Member Derek Green, and to the members of our working and advisory groups who provided input for this study.
Okay, thank you for your testimony. I just have some initial questions. As you were doing your research, and I was struck by a couple of the comments that you made, one about a structural problem and a structural solution. And I got the sense that you also said that the city should disrupt the status quo, and you're referring to a public bank concept, right? Okay. You also made reference to the fact that the city should leverage its dollars as a way to achieve this goal.
That's correct.
Right. Okay. And then going into some of the points you made in reference to a municipal authority, and you were talking about an entity that would actually receive deposits and also lend as a traditional bank?
Yes, this authority would receive deposits from the city. It would be city deposits, and then it could lend to small businesses either directly or it could also lend indirectly through vehicles such as CDFIs.
Okay, and then you based that need for changes in state and local legislation based on the fact that this is an entity that would receive deposits. But what if this is an entity that just did lending? Would that also change some of your analysis per se?
So the bank needs to be capitalized, and maybe to make sure we're definitionally using the same terms, the deposits, the city deposits, is the money in which the bank is capitalized. It's the money it has to lend. We don't have a recommendation on deposits from other sources outside of city government. There's many. They can be from school districts. They can be from other kind of mission-driven institutions. That receiving deposits from other places, in addition to receiving deposits from the city, requires enabling legislation.
And so your basis of that determination is based on your conversations with both, from my understanding, the law department as well as the treasurer's office.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, because I know we've also had some conversation with the law department and the treasurer's office subsequent to the report, and raise some other nuances that still need to be investigated. Because I know you relied upon the law department to provide you with guidance and information, but also in subsequent conversations with the law department, they've also provided some additional perspectives that some additional research would need to occur based on some of the things that were raised in your analysis. And so your perspective was kind of an initial concept in reference to the creation of a public bank, but some additional analysis still could be required or needed in order to actually implement this type of institution.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you for that clarification. I think we see this as an initial step and as an important one, but it's complicated. And I think everything will need closer looks by those who will do the actual implementation.
Right, especially some of the concepts and perspectives in reference to the governance. You made reference to having, professional management, others who made that same response. And those additional things that would need to be researched and investigated in reference to the structure. I'm also curious in reference to your experience as a firm on some other studies, and you've worked with some other cities and jurisdictions on this type of work. Where are some of those entities now since they started that investigation, and also any other jurisdictions that you may be working with that you're able to talk about?
Sure. Well, let me say one thing, Councilman, just to your prior question. I think we draw the distinction in our analysis was to determine feasibility. The next step would then be determine how would you go about implementing. So you would need to do a business plan. You would need to further investigate. What we were charged with doing was the question, is this feasible to meet the goals of the working group? And that was the task that we undertook. So I just wanted to draw the distinction between a business planning and implementation exercise and a determination of feasibility.
Right. And
on the second, yeah.
So just basically a fundamental perspective based on the research and the need, which is also even further demonstrated because of COVID, that this is a disruption to the status quo to change a structural problem, and that this concept is feasible. But the additional details are much more implementation aspects and a business model or additional steps that were beyond your scope, but you just focus on the feasibility of this concept of public banking, which I think you've answered yes from my reading of the report.
Well, and so yes, and we looked at two models. And one being a public bank that simply replaces the city's existing banking relationships. That is not feasible. The second was to capitalize the city with a function and a role of lending to small businesses of the city of Philadelphia. We determined that is feasible. The next step would then be to come up with an implementation plan. The reason I make that distinction is because the bank to do what is an important question in the determination of whether or not it is a feasible enterprise for the city.
Okay. Well, we'll focus on the feasible aspect, but if you can kind of give some more perspective on some of the other things that we raised in the question.
Sure. Well, in terms of other cities, as we say in the report, that there is no American city with a public bank. We have investigated ourselves the feasibility of a public bank in Seattle. We know that the city of Washington, D.C. recently received a feasibility study, but we are not aware of it acting any further on that study. The state of California has passed enabling legislation, and cities are currently in varying states of preparing to act on that determination of feasibility. So what Philadelphia is considering here would make it a pioneer in thinking about how a public bank could meet a very specific function, and in this case, of lending to the small businesses that could reduce the racial wealth gap that characterizes Philadelphia.
And you talked a little bit, you mentioned enabling legislation in California. Could you provide some perspective on that legislation? And is it simply just enables jurisdictions to create a public bank? Could you provide some additional clarity?
That's correct. That's precisely what the state legislation does. So any step in the determination of the feasibility of a city bank requires enabling legislation at the state level. In California, they began with the enabling legislation at the state level, and now cities have the option and the opportunity to pursue their path to establishing a public bank.
And what cities are looking at that based on your understanding?
Based on our view, none of these cities have put out a business plan or engaged in a business planning process. The city of Los Angeles had attempted to do their first step in creating a public bank by issuing a public referendum to amend the charter to allow the city to establish a public bank. That referendum failed. To the best of our knowledge, we have not seen any cities yet advance a business plan for establishing a public bank. Of course, this all happened within the last year, and now in a COVID reality. So, we know there were cities like Long Beach that were investigating public banks. Their mayors had talked about with excitement the prospect. There's a strong advocacy community in LA that wants to do this again because there were other issues on the ballot that might have complicated the support for a public bank. But no one, to the best of our knowledge, has moved forward with a feasibility study along the lines of what the city of Philadelphia has done, or certainly not to business planning stage. I neglected to say there have been feasibility studies in Santa Fe as well. And Ariel, I might be forgetting one other city where a university partner put together a feasibility study, but it's a handful.
And how did COVID change any of your analysis? Because I listened to Ariel's testimony. She talked about how, there's a feasibility, and we'll say feasibility from a small business perspective. A lot of her testimony talked about the inequities in access to credit, the growth of businesses, especially in communities of color, and I would say in particular African-American communities. And I've seen that from my own background as a banker. How has COVID impacted that to make this an even stronger issue in reference to there needs to be a structural solution to the structural problem of inequity, and that why we should disrupt the status quo with a small business model for public banking?
I'll let Ariel address the substance of the question because we struggled with this in our study, having hit midway through or more than that through our study process. I will say the urgency is clearer. It doesn't change any of the steps that are required and that are significant to establish a feasible public bank.
Yeah, and I'll add to it, in addition to the urgency, I think that kind of as we dove into this, and especially on the legal side, setting up this bank is going to take a lot of time to make it through the legislative process. And so the public bank, so we have COVID-19 hit us, this pandemic that struck, and we need immediate relief and support. And the public bank isn't here today, but we do think opportunistically into future situations, hopefully no more global pandemics, but other crises that will require cities and municipalities to help uplift and support their small businesses. And by having infrastructure in place, such as a public bank, you're prepared for those emergencies down the road. And I think that became really clear when we were thinking about how can we. So we're evaluating the feasibility of this entity. We wish it was here today, and we wish it was able to act upon the challenges.
As you were doing your...
We could also say... Oh, sorry, Kevin.
I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say that there were proposals that were offered, by others we're aware of, for a public bank facility to take advantage of some of the federal aid in the way that it was structured and dispersed. We did not evaluate the feasibility of those proposals because that was beyond our scope. But there were ideas in the discourse about how a public bank either could or could have served as a vehicle to receive federal funding, but we didn't get into that in our feasibility assessment.
As you were researching the feasibility on the small business model and looking at local and state laws, I don't like to make assumptions, but what review did you do of like economic development financing laws, like those laws that have enabled Philadelphia Industrial Development Corporation to provide loans similar to what Councilmember Jones talked about, which is the former Philadelphia Commercial Development Corporation that also provides loans as a lending entity?
Sure. And so in our conversations with the city's legal team and the commercial law unit, PAID was certainly a precedent to look towards in terms of how to use the economic development financing law to then go through the General Assembly and establish an authority. I think it is one of the reasons we got to the finding that an authority was an important vehicle for the public bank. We also learned a great deal from PIDC and the CDFI that they operate kind of as part of their entity. And yeah, they were instructive and they were promising too, because they show that these types of solutions have been done in the Philadelphia context. Of course, it'll be all about the layering because, as you remember, the lending gap that we calculated of $840 million is significant, and you really need something at scale to close that gap, more so than any program really we've seen the city put forward so far.
Right, and so in those conversations, you talked with both PIDC and also, PCDC is a former entity that Councilman Jones ran that was acquired by PIDC. But PIDC, being a city-related entity, does provide lending through a CDFI, and that's something that you did see. They have the ability, and that you use the legal authority. Not legal authority. Legal analysis from the law department, not your own legal analysis, but from the law department, to come up with your foundation and as well as small business model for your study.
Yep, that's correct.
And I want to underscore one point that Ariel was making, Councilman, if I may. That for the spirit of this inquiry was not, can you set up a public bank for the sake of setting up a public bank? The spirit of this was, can you set up a public bank because it would meet the stated need, which began with the legislation that you introduced, of addressing poverty in Philadelphia, with a belief that you can address poverty by creating jobs. Small businesses create jobs. The poverty is deeply racialized in Philly. There is the legacy of racism in banking in Philly that leaves us with inadequate capital to Black and Latinx businesses. So we were looking at how could a public bank solve for that? The next stage of this, in order to be a meaningful exercise, would have to generate a return to meet that gap. The bank would have to be sufficiently capitalized to generate a return to meet that gap in order for this exercise to be meaningful and to positively impact the lives of Philadelphians in the way that you had envisioned. We have to start from that. Is it feasible to address that gap? That is the most important question. We addressed feasibility. We addressed that it is possible to generate a return that would make this a promising exercise for the city. But the next step is the degree to which the bank would have to be capitalized such that that gap could be met. That is the North Star, not the establishment of the public bank. And that is how we undertook our inquiry. And I think that is the spirit of the charge that you had given us.
Okay. I don't want to monopolize the time because we could be doing this for quite a bit. At this point, allow any council members, if they had any questions, who want to jump in. Seeing none, I just want to close with this. I want to thank Ms. Dunn, as well as Ms. Schlesinger and Ms. Benjamin for your participation in the study and providing this feasibility study in reference to creating a public bank. I think your report really provided a strong basis for the urgency and the need. And I keep reflecting on the fact that you acknowledge that it's a very significant structural problem that needs a structural solution, and that you recommended that the city should leverage its dollars and to find a way to disrupt the status quo, which is something I believe the public bank does. I think the concept of how we focus that concept, so, public banking can be a very broad perspective, but I think you focus very specifically based on where you saw trying to address the most need and the greatest ability by helping provide access to credit to small businesses, and how that will leverage a larger need for the city of Philadelphia, considering we have some of the historical inequities that we have, especially for people of color and African American and Latin constituents in our city, especially business owners, and how COVID-19 has only increased that. If you look at any of the information that's been discussed in previous hearings, my hearing that I've done jointly with Councilmember Squilla in reference to recovery, Councilmember Dom's hearings on the fiscal stability. I know he has an upcoming hearing as well regarding the disparate impacts of African-American businesses and the lack thereof in the city due to a number of issues. And I think COVID has only demonstrated that concern, and your report goes to that. But you also provide that we need to provide some additional work and research in reference to an implementation strategy. Some of the things that have you raising concerns from a legal analysis, as well as some of the other administrative aspects. And we've been engaging in conversation with the law department, as well as the treasurer's office regarding some of those issues, which go to that next phase in reference to how a public bank can be created and what steps we need to take. I know in our conversation with the law department, there's been some additional things that they need to research that may or may not be within their capacity as a city solicitor's office, and may need some outside counsel to help. I know you relied upon their work and research to get to this point, but some of the additional questions and concerns have come up in reference to, do we need to take some of those additional steps that you stated in your report? And so we'll continue to work with the law department in that regard, as well as with the treasurer's office, as well as others who are participating in this call, both from the working group and other advocates for this issue, to come up with a balanced approach as we move forward with this initiative and towards the creation of a public bank. Not seeing any other witnesses or any other members of council that would like to testify. Am I correct in my, I won't say assumption, but my position, Mr. Iannuzzi?
As far as I know.
Okay, thank you. So I just want to thank all of you for your work and participation. I know we've been working on this issue and this research for some time, and we're going to continue this conversation, continue to work so we can move forward to the creation of this entity. And I don't see any other questions or comments from members of the committee. Being no further questions from members of the Finance Committee and no other witnesses to testify, I will ask if there's no one else to present in this hearing, because then we have failed to call, and that wishes to offer testimony on any of the bill, and that wishes to offer testimony on this resolution being considered today. Hearing none, I want to thank all the panels of witnesses for their participation. Value your opinions. This concludes the public hearing of the Finance Committee. We will now recess this hearing until the call to chair. Thank you very much for all your work and your attendance and participation, and we will continue this conversation as we move toward the creation of a public bank in the city of Philadelphia. Thank you so much.